We're really happy to be here and to enter into a little bit of this broad field of ethics. And we're approaching this, I should say, from the get-go from a very academic standpoint, and also we're coming to this from as a bunch of linguists, and sort of to give a little bit of background of kind of who we are and our sort of our thinking and sort of the context for our study here. We thought we'd just give a couple comments on what do we mean by quantitative humanities, because for some people those things might actually be almost like an oxymoron, that humanities are by nature not quantitative. They're either qualitative or they're sort of neither quantitative nor qualitative. And so we thought as a way to kind of define where we're coming from, you can sort of think of a discipline such as ours in terms of both substance and method. And like I said, we're linguists. And so, to think sort of broader than just linguistics, we're approaching this issue of questionable research practices in terms of defining our sort of disciplinary background. You can think of it in terms of substance, and in that sense, think about kind of the liberal studies. If you have a background, we're all, probably a lot of us have spent a lot of time around universities, think fields like literature and ethnic studies and empirical philosophy, linguistics, of course. In terms of who we are in the quantitative humanities, as far as method, another way of kind of defining who we are, well, we overlap a lot actually with the social sciences. And in some ways, linguistics can sort of fit both. We sort of bridge the humanities and the social sciences. Our data sources, the ways that we get data to analyze, comes from human subjects research. So sometimes it's lab-based studies, sometimes more classroom-based research. We do a lot of text analysis. A lot of us have background in what's called corpus linguistics, where we analyze large bodies of text using computer software. We do survey research, we do educational testing. These are some of the main data sources that we use. In terms of, because we're talking about the quantitative humanities, we also do a lot of statistical modeling. So we analyze basic descriptive statistics, things like frequencies, percentages. We look at group differences across conditions, across text types, across different linguistic backgrounds. We look at associations like correlations, regression, path analyses, and other types of multivariate analyses. Just to kind of give a little bit of a quick background of where we're coming from in terms of both substance and method. We got interested in this topic of questionable research practices based on some work that came out about a decade ago by John et al. As well as Finelli, Danielle Finelli. And both these papers have been fairly seminal. And the idea that they try to put forward is that when we're engaging in quantitative research in particular, but this could apply also, of course, in the qualitative realm, that we sort of have a continuum of different research practices. We can do research that might fall into the category of what we refer to as RCR, responsible conduct of research. These are just the things that we're all supposed to do, and everything's going just fine if we're conducting research according to in an RCR sort of style or approach. And then sort of following the rules, essentially, for best practices. And then we all know that there are things that are sort of totally unacceptable, absolute categorical research misconduct, things like data falsification, fabrication, plagiarism. Okay, obviously wrong, and no reasonable person would accept those as okay. But we have in the middle this sort of big chunk of practices that that are not necessarily absolutely wrong, and not necessarily, but certainly not also absolutely right or okay. So things like selective reporting of results, or maybe omitting certain methodological details, what some people might refer to as a sin of omission. P-hacking, if you engage in quantitative research, sort of modifying your analyses such that you're more likely to achieve statistical significance, things like that. Okay, and so just to give a couple more examples, we're going to go through all of these, but we sometimes when we teach research methods, when I do anyway, I'll set up these kind of scenarios just to get people thinking about the fact that there's a lot of judgment in our research. We like to think that we're following sort of standards of empirical inquiry in any field, but really that there's a lot of gray areas in the decisions that we make. And so we might propose a bunch of different scenarios or situations or decisions that we have to make. Like what if one part of the study was especially complicated, and we feel like a reviewer might critique it, so we may sort of omit a certain part of our methods? Or what if we only report certain findings, the ones that were fall in line with our hypotheses going into the study? Well, we have to make choices about what we're going to report. Certainly we have more data usually in most studies than we can actually report in one study. So we have to make choices. And so is that okay to sort of omit some of the results that don't align with what we expected or hoped to find? Things like that. And so as Finelli put it, these misbehaviors lie somewhere on a continuum between scientific fraud, bias, and simple carelessness. And there's lots of different sort of origins, causes of these types of behaviors or practices. Sometimes it's pure ignorance. Sometimes it's trying to sort of self-promote a little bit. Sometimes it's just being sloppy. But in any case, we have this sort of broad section of practices that are in this gray area. And that's what we mean when we refer to questionable. We're not saying questionable is sort of categorically wrong. We're just saying it's in that gray area. So we're also building on a recent study just out in a journal called the Modern Language Journal, published by Isbell et al. And it was actually the first study to look at questionable research practices in just applied linguistics, which is our home discipline. And they developed a survey of QRPs, and they got that survey out to 351 applied linguists. And their results were actually a bit dramatic. They found that 94% of the participants admitted to one or more of these QRPs, like selective reporting or obscuring methodological messiness. And actually 17% admitted to one or more instances of misconduct, including data fabrication or falsification. This is a really disappointing and dramatic finding for a lot of reasons, both just in general, to think that potentially 1 in 6 of our colleagues have engaged in this kind of practice, but also relative to other fields, because the Finelli 2009 study, which was a meta-analysis essentially averaging studies just like this across other fields, found an average around 2 to 4% admission rate of misconduct. And so we ask ourselves, why is it so much higher in applied linguistics? Might this be a problem that's more broadly present across the quantitative humanities? We don't really know. A couple of limitations of this study that led to our study were that this instrument by Isbell et al., which was we think it's a good first start in this area, but it lacked comprehensiveness. It was developed in maybe a somewhat casual way, and it was not humanities specific. It was drawing on sets of QRPs from previous studies that were mostly from the social sciences, and in some cases from the medical sciences and the natural sciences. And so we wanted to, we thought these items may not necessarily apply. Some of these practices might not apply entirely in the quantitative humanities. And then again, their research was just interested in QRPs in the presence, in the context of one discipline, applied linguistics, which is great to know about, but we wanted to look a little bit more broadly. Okay, so the current study, and this is phase 1 of 3 of a larger funded study, and what we're trying to do here is simply develop a taxonomy of QRPs specific for the quantitative humanities. Okay, because we felt like maybe the existing instruments, there wasn't really any, there really was no existing taxonomy or even a list of QRPs for this discipline or this broad domain of research. And that's what we're trying to do here, set out, come up with a sort of a comprehensive and thorough and field specific or discipline specific set of QRPs. Good so far? Everybody with me? Okay. Cool. So we thought about lots of different ways of doing this. We're like, how are we gonna do this? Well, and the way that we came up with, one of our co-authors was familiar, Scott Sterling was familiar with this approach. I'm not sure if anybody else who's here is familiar with this, the Delphi method. And the Delphi method is a way to kind of generate, take a bottom-up sort of qualitative elicitation technique to develop a set of items or a way of understanding sort of the full coverage of a particular construct. And so we decided to take this approach, and we'll explain this as we go for the next few minutes. As I said, it's a bottom-up qualitative technique. It relies on sort of community-generated data, and it's a very iterative process. And so we go through several rounds of generation of ideas and feedback, and involves an expert panel, involves our expertise. We look at the previous literature in sort of this iterative fashion. So let's see how this played out. So our process looked like this. We initially tried to, the first goal, the goal of this whole phase 1 study was to develop an initial list of potential QRPs. And so what we did was we approached or identified an expert panel and we asked them to participate. And this expert panel was comprised of 10 individuals that were humanities researchers that were interested in ethical issues. We brought in some researcher trainers in the quantitative humanities, and we also invited experienced researchers that were not necessarily deeply involved in ethics or methodological training, but had a lot of research, had a lot of experience conducting empirical research in the quantitative humanities, so that we would draw on their expertise as well. This panel was this sort of diverse panel. We tried to look for people across different areas of the quantitative humanities. Was invited to suggest QRPs. And we explained to them this idea of QRPs first, because they weren't coming in totally cold. And we provided them with kind of as a prompt to get them thinking about different aspects of the research process where QRPs might sneak into decisions that we all make. We asked them to think about QRPs in the context of funding, research design and data collection, including instrumentation, data analysis, the dissemination phase, so the write-up and dissemination. We asked them to think about QRPs in the context of service, as well as in mentorship. So for example, certain authorship issues that come up maybe in the context of mentorship. Okay. From there, we collected all the items from our panel. This is sort of following the Delphi method. Okay. Then we reviewed those items and we looked for there was certainly overlap, and we kind of consolidated them into a single list. And then we wanted to make sure, we thought, even though we have this great expert panel, there may be things that just they may not have thought of. And so we thought, well, let's supplement our potential list of QRPs. And we did that looking at the Isbell et al. Survey items. We thought, well, are there any areas of coverage? You think about like sort of coverage of the construct of QRPs, and we wanted to kind of supplement what we had. And so we looked at existing items from the Isbell et al. Survey. We looked at previous studies of QRPs in other fields, which seem, maybe some of their items might have been relevant and missing from the list of items that we generated. We looked at existing taxonomies. There are other taxonomies that are out there. We also drew on, of course, our own experience. Us as a group, we have lots and lots of years of research experience, and as researchers, as authors, reviewers, editors, training junior researchers and scholars, our experience seeking funds, and as students and mentors. Okay, so we sort of tried to think about all the different ways that QRPs could make their way into the research process from those different types of angles. And at this point, we also we had two categories, service and mentoring, and we removed those because we felt like after considering them, they weren't really part of research. So again, our focus is on questionable research practices. And we thought that, things like service, and this had to do with sometimes whether ethical decisions can sneak into the process of manuscript reviewing, for example. And also mentoring, we felt like a separate issue, and we'd like to return to that in another study, but for now we thought we'd just focus on those first four categories, which were just about research. Okay, I know I got to keep moving here. And then we had a total of 62 potential QRPs or items. Okay, so this is just what it looks like. We're not going to go through these, of course, all of them, but this is the four categories and the 62 items that we came up with. And just to give a couple of examples. So cherry picking samples or data or results that favor a funder. An example in the grouping for design and data collection, we had employing instruments or measures without a strong validity argument. Okay, we want to see instruments or measures that have a strong validity argument behind them. That's questionable if you use an instrument or a measure or a scale that doesn't have a strong validity argument. And then under data analysis, one example is removing items or cases in order to obtain a more favorable result. Okay. So from there, we took these items, the 62 items, okay, and we put them on, we made a Qualtrics survey, and we sent, we were looking for potentially three different types of outcomes. We wanted to either accept each item as it is, we wanted to accept it maybe pending minor revision, or we wanted to look for significant revision or recommendations of reject. And we also asked for comments, and this is from our expert panel. So we sent this instrument to the expert panel. And the panel, this is essentially, we're not going to go through this, of course, but we looked at, this is the kind of what the data that came back from the panel looked like. And so you can see over here, they could either, again, they could select one of those options. They could select accept as is, accept maybe just change this word or something like that, or they could recommend that we cut it or we majorly revise it. Okay. And so what we did was we wanted to, we as a group decided that we were going to accept items that at least 80% of the panel also considered acceptable. Okay, and we would put those aside in our sort of final set. Other ones were either removed if it was decided they were unacceptable, or they were revised and sent back to the panel. So in a sort of cyclical, iterative process. Okay, we went through 4 rounds of this. Just to give an example of one item, this item started out, that sort of the development or the growth of an item. This item, nudging participants to join a study using monetary or other incentives. Well, one of the comments we got from one of our panelists was, needs better define nudging. Is it a QRP if we all do it? Which is it's just kind of funny, the idea that maybe it's okay if we all do it. It's not necessarily true, but anyway, so our decision was, well, we got to revise this. We got to revise this idea of nudging. Maybe people will interpret that in different ways, and so we thought, let's think about that some more. And so we changed it to, in round 2.2, recruiting participants to join a study in a way that saying no feels wrong, e.g., using an emotional story when during classroom recruitment. Okay, so one of the comments we got there was, maybe change to in a way that makes refusal difficult or uncomfortable. Emotional story, I'm all in favor of emotion. How about using coercion during classroom recruitment, or by pleading or shaming participants into agreeing? That seemed like maybe a little bit too strong, but anyway, we decided that at that point we had to revise. And finally, we ended up with the item of recruiting participants to join a study in a way that makes refusal difficult or uncomfortable. And there was a further comment there, like they wanted maybe us to add unduly, but we decided in the end to accept it. This seemed, we had overall agreement by the panelists. And the reason why is that using coercion felt like actually, well, no, that would actually put the researcher into the realm of not questionable, but actually unethical. And we would consider that misconduct. So anytime there's coercion, to us, coercion is actually, by definition, misconduct from a researcher perspective. And so we didn't want to include coercion in the item, but we felt comfortable with this. And this was widely agreed upon by our panel. Okay, just to give an overview of the different items and how we got to our final set of 58 items. We start out, like I said, with 62 items. Okay, and this is each of these rounds. And these are each of the recommendations by the number of different recommendations in the panel. So in round 1, we start with 62 items, like I said. 43 items accepted by 80% of the panel. They went right to the final set. Okay, so those went right to our final list. They were accepted by at least 80%. 3 of them were almost totally rejected by the panel, so we rejected those. 15 of them we got sort of a revise and resubmit from our panel. So they said, okay, well, this maybe works, but you need to change the wording in this way. And so those made their way into round 2. And then an additional 1 item was suggested that made it to round 2. Okay, so then in round 2, we've got 16 items to work with. 16 items went out to the same panel, and 9 items were immediately accepted. Okay, the revisions that we made were considered acceptable. 1 item was removed, considered unacceptable. 6 needed revision. Okay, so these went here, 6 items, and then those 6 items all considered acceptable. Okay, so you can sort of just see the kind of process of how we got from here to here, and it's sort of a non-linear, but again, cyclical and iterative process. Okay. In the final breakdown of items across the 4 categories, in the end, we had 11 items in the funding category, 11 referring to QRPs in the context of design and data collection, 14 for analysis, 22 for dissemination. So lots of potential for QRPs in our write-up and dissemination. Just about done here. Next steps, we're going to develop a survey. So now that we have our taxonomy, and I have the full taxonomy in case anybody wants to see it, we're going to develop a survey of taxonomy. And the item types that we're considering right now are to ask researchers in the quantitative humanities about both the acceptability of these different QRPs, like how acceptable do they find them versus unacceptable. And then also we're asking about the frequency of their usage, or if I say commit, of how often they've committed these QRPs. I know it sounds a little bit on the more negative side, but that's what we're looking to find out, is how often they've engaged in these QRPs, as well as how acceptable or unacceptable they find them. Right now, we're just about to start the piloting, and then we're going to be repiloting that survey. And the plan is to administer the survey to a larger sample of quantitative humanities researchers in the US and in Sweden both because that's where we're based, and also this project was funded by Swedish grant agencies, and so we want to engage with those communities for sure, and also conduct some cross-cultural comparisons. We also plan to then, beyond the survey itself, based on the results of the survey, develop a set of online scenario-based materials for researcher training. Of course, we'll pilot these materials. They'll be made publicly available to researcher trainers. And we plan to have 3 units in the training. A unit on what are simply QRPs and why they matter. 2, how we can prevent them. And then 3, materials for discussion and scenario-based training. That will be available for anybody in the quantitative humanities. That can, of course, also be tailored. And we'll also be hosting a series of workshops. This is also funded by the grant to raise awareness of ethical considerations in quantitative humanities research. That's it. That's all we have to say. Thank you so much, everybody, for being here. We are very, very open and welcoming to any comments, questions, suggestions. You've got my email there if any questions come up. We do want to recognize our very generous funders. This project is funded by the Swedish Research Council, as well as the Swedish Academy of Letters, History, and Antiquities. And finally, we have a QR code if anybody would be interested or willing to look at the pre-pilot version of our survey based on the taxonomy. We would love any feedback, not so much on the items, although we'd be happy to get feedback on that as well, but just the structure and to see if it kind of works and makes sense the way we have it set up. So I'll stop there. Thank you so much.
Great. What a thorough run through of all the hard work you guys have done. I'm curious if there is any comments. I don't see anything in the chat yet. If anyone has a question, feel free to either raise your hand or unmute. With that QR code, do you have a link for the training, or is that sort of in the works?
Still in the works. The training is going to come after we do the survey, because the survey is probably going to inform the training. If we find that there's perhaps more of a need for some QRPs than others, we might emphasize those more in the training. Yeah, but thank you. So yeah, but they haven't even begun to develop the training. I'm looking forward to that a lot, though. As somebody who does I do a lot of researcher training, and I feel like in researcher training in the quantitative humanities and linguistics, ethics, it gets maybe 1 day in the semester, if that. And unless you happen to take research methods with Scott here, you maybe get a little more, because Scott has a long history of working in research. He's one of the only individuals actually in our field that up till now has sort of specialized in and strongly identifies with research ethics as one of his main research interests and areas of expertise. But you know, unless you get research method with Scott, you're getting maybe 1 day, and that day is probably mostly limited to how do you fill out the IRB or the ethics committee paperwork, basically, which is, you know, so our human subjects board. And that's such a limited view on what it means, what ethics means in the quantitative humanities.
Well, we got a little bit of time before we transition. Any members of the panel, is there anything you want to highlight or a question that you're hoping would have been asked that you'd like to address?
If I could ask a question. Thank you. And I'm actually really curious about, do you have any plans then to compare and think about your questionable research practices that you identify for linguistics, and then compare it to the larger field? And because what's really nice is you're doing this nice iterative work to really fine tune them. And so it'll be really interesting to see if they're generalizable or what the connection will be to other fields.
That's a great question. Yeah, we do plan to look at that. And so our sampling strategy, we're sort of right now developing kind of a sampling frame to then approach different scholars in different quantitative humanities, which is a tricky proposition because not everybody in humanities disciplines engages in quantitative research. And so the way that we're sort of developing that, you know, or approaching those individuals or finding out who to actually invite to participate is difficult. But yeah, I'd certainly like to look at, we certainly plan to look at the prevalence of QRPs across different disciplines. And maybe those folks over in history, you know, those guys are super unethical. No, I doubt that that's the case. But it may be that the different fields have different types of standards. Empirical question, I suppose.